Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Advancing Consciousness Podcast. Today is episode 14, and we're going to look at the real purpose of polarity and contrast. But we're going to even go deeper and look at, is it part of our natural design? Is it absolutely necessary and beneficial? Or can it actually be something that may impede us? So stay tuned as we explore that today. So a lot of people talk about this polarity and contrast and its necessity in experiencing life. Without polarities, we don't advance. Without polarities, we don't appreciate the two extremes or multiple extremes if we choose to play with all of that. And of course, the contrast is, well, if we don't have the contrast, we don't have that deeper realization. But it makes you wonder, is it really something that is part of our nature? Or was that something that was programmed in later on? This is worth exploring because as I spent quite a bit of time looking at our true operating system that was put in place when the planet was retooled 15,000 years ago, and these bodies were created and seeded on planet Earth with all its variations, that as I looked at that, I noticed that polarity and contrast was not part of the operating system. So that was quite an eye-opener for me, and an eye-opener to observe what was really going on. Now, of course, my soul made it very clear at the time that polarity and contrast was not in the design. That was being experienced on different realms and dimensions within other planets and so forth. However, when planet Earth was retooled and reseeded, they didn't want to really explore with that at all and kind of make it so that in fact it was a completely different design, that advancement was self-realization and also advancement was through experience. And the experience did not have to be polarized, and it did not have to have contrast for us to advance. Because in a way, by just exploring, we kind of lived in the moment, and each moment we created our experiences. We gained what we needed to create or learn from the experience, and then just create something different. Now, of course, you had the capacities to have variances in there so that you would not, just create from one level, but you would be able to create what some people may refer to as polarity, but it wasn't really polarity. It was about creating certain experiences that would hold more light or less light, more consciousness, more or less consciousness. But again, it was just more experiential and staying tuned with whatever we learned and grew through the experiences that we created. Polarity was not, and contrast was not, introduced until some 5,000 years later, which was about 10,000 years ago, when the inverted matrix was applied. When the inverted matrix was applied, the artificial intelligence we call the ego was applied into our operating system, and there was modifications that took place not only on the planet operating system, but the sentient beings operating system and our own operating system. That was necessary as it was introduced, and of course we've agreed to have that experience, to experience polarity, separation, and what we call also contrast. Now, this was kind of a requirement as part of the experience that was plugged in with the modification of the operating system. That also was introducing from going in organic 3D to an inorganic, or what we call an inverted 3D, and then leading into inverted 2D and 2D itself, which basically was a huge level of separation and disconnect. So part of that changing was experiencing a deep separation where we do not recognize ourselves more than what we see ourselves as a body, and the experiences that was gained not only from the body but what the mind has observed and so forth. So in doing so, we kind of lost that stronger connection, that clear connection that we had as sourceness, but also the connection that we may have had from all the different interconnections that we had through the DNA, which were all beautiful streams of energy, consciousness, and so forth, for all the brother sister souls that were contributors to this redesigned body that we entered, or at least this series of body. And so that had to be isolated too, because to experience separation, experience polarity, it would be difficult if we still continue to receive streaming of consciousness in that level. And the separation also occurred from layers of filters that were also applied through our own human entity, filters through our own innate body consciousness, and filters from our soul. Now, what did these filters do? The filters reduced the amount of capacity and accessibility we had. The filters actually tainted some of the information and also applied a reduction in certain spectrums of light and consciousness that was carried through those different streams. Now, some of those veils were also applied through our third eye, or in this case, quite a bit, where we were accessing other souls that were either souls on the planet or souls on different dimensions and so forth, and any other levels of consciousness that were available from not only the planetary level, because that was one part from other playmates on the planet, but also from the solar system and then galaxy and also universe. Now, of course, depending on what level of consciousness we're in and what level of advancement we're in, even if that wasn't stopped or filtered in any way, we wouldn't be able to access the full thing anyways, including source essence, because that would actually take us away from having this human, what we call human experience. It would have shifted that in a big way. Anyways, when it came to polarity and contrast, it was plugged in. It was something that was added in to our original operating system. That allowed us to have different levels of creation and experience. Now, we could say, well, that was some benefit to it. And in a way, there was, because we wouldn't have been able to create or experience what we call polarity or contrast without that operating system, and really get lost in the game. Because before, getting lost in the game was not kind of an option, because it was something we were tuned not to do. We realized that we were in the game. We got to experience fully the game, but we also got to experience how we could shape and direct the game. And the game had levels of reality, which was our own personal reality and all the beautiful clusters we chose to play with to create cluster consciousness or cluster realities, but also from a planetary level where we had the opportunity also to play with all other aspects of ourselves and the consciousnesses that were gained. Now, that was always there before, but now we were learning it from contrast. So this thing about good, bad, right, wrong did not exist, but it did get plugged in at some point. So, or at this point when all of that inverted stuff was put into place. So in saying all of that, when we're looking at all of this, we're saying, okay, here we are, we adopted the idea that of polarity and contrast. So that we cannot learn without pain, we cannot learn and grow without experiencing the total opposite. So for us to experience what people refer to as light, we had to experience darkness. For us to be able to experience right and wrong, which were all made up concepts in the first place because it didn't exist before, every creation was perfect, every creation had perfect opportunity. But then we started to polarize our label and define good and bad experiences. And then at the same time, we also, what was added was this whole thing about karmic and balancing and all of that stuff, which, we won't get into this episode, but we will in another episode. But in essence, when we started looking at that, the polarity became a tool for us to experience extreme one way or another. What the interesting part was that while we were playing in the game of polarity, it omitted wholeness. It omitted one or the other. And then that created not only a contrast, but a polarization conflict, which meant that if you played in light, then the darkness, because it's all part of the whole, wanted to merge with the light and create what we call 0 point pure creation, which was the original design. But at the same time, so as we played in light, we would somewhat attract the negative. And so we would have an exposure to what we would call negative or dark. And so we played the game of switching from one side to the other. Now, of course, as being souls and being perfectly powerful beings, we gave ourselves the opportunity to play polarity. So some lives we played what we refer to as dark, and other lives we played what we refer as light. Some darks we were the victimizer, and some lives we played the victim. We played where we were totally unconscious, then semi-conscious. We played different roles of, being perpetrators in one way or another to the system and so forth. So all of that became part of our experience. And we've played that experience for 10,000 years. So the way the modification came about for us to make any huge leaps or any leaps at this point in time, we needed to experience both sides. We needed to get into the depth of it because that's how the program was modified. It never was integral to our true design, our true blueprint that was part of our experience or part of what we were tooled to experience. But at the same time, we still played the game and still got into the depth of it, and we got to experience the whole game of polarity. Now, during that period of time, the only way we did actually make advancements because of the modification was through polarity, through contrast, and so forth. So it means like you have to really experience both sides for you to actually have a slight leap forward. And most of it was baby steps, of course, but baby steps of realization, learning, enlightenment, and so forth. Now, because of the polarity and the necessity of contrast, and also the programming was designed for us to go into what we went through from an organic 3D, self-awareness, but with the realization of being in physical form and exploring and expanding form to what we call the inverted matrix. And the inverted or inverted 3D state through the inverted matrix, and also inverted 2D state. So what that meant is for us to shift from that, we went into those states, and those states emphasize polarity. So for us to play polarity, to play contrast, we had to be in that inverted 3D, 2D state of being in the world that was also very polarized, because that's how it represented for us, and that's how we viewed it. Very polarized, good, bad, somebody taking advantage of others, somebody being the victim of others, and so forth. Control came into the fact. The control where you had freedom and others did not, or the majority didn't have freedom and certain others had freedom, or what they projected freedom. But then to do that, they had to play the control card, which was basically others taking on the role of you could refer to as the victimizer, but really the ones that said, hey, I'm in charge, I'm in control, I tell you what you can or cannot do and what you can play with and not. Now, you could see a lot of deities were created accordingly because that didn't exist before. So the polarity and contrast part also showed how the deities would actually reign over us, and our work that we did is to always shift to a what we call one side of the polarity to be able to be looked at in a way where we were deemed to go to another life of some sort. That was the concept of be able to advance in one way or another, because that was only possible if you played your cards right and you played in the correct polarity compartment, I guess you want to call it, or cluster. So this was all that was applied in the polarity and contrast world. So let's fast forward and let's go to where we are today. Of course, if you observe, contrast, polarity is alive and well and heavily played for. In fact, it has become accentuated even more in this last year. Accentuated more to give us the opportunity to become saturated, but at the same time, to be able to come to that realization where does it really serve us or not? Now, with the changes that have occurred, and that we are in progress with, the question still comes up, does it still serve us or does it impede us? Well, there's two ways to look at that. If we feel that it's absolutely necessary and we still give a lot of power to it, then, we use it, we utilize it, and somehow it assists us. The fact that we're experiencing the intensity, it's assisting us because we get to see the game of polarity, see it for its true colors, see it to its fullest, and then really decide from a higher intuitive part, are we going to use this any longer or not? And as we activate more of our natural blueprint, we see how it was applied and it does not serve. Now, we've gone through a couple of changes. In 1987, well, basically the end of 86, going into 87, we had harmonic convergence. That changed a lot of our operating system. One of the key things was it was no longer necessary for us to experience polarity for growth, polarity to advance, polarity to become enlightened. And that applied to also contrast. It also eliminated the necessity that was applied, and wasn't absolute necessity, but it was when this conversion or this converting that occurred back in 10,000 years ago, the need for karma. That meant the need to balance. Now, karma is a whole different topic, which we'll cover on another episode. But in essence, the necessity of karma was gone. The program of self-destruct, victim-victimizer, and dominance was also removed. So these were removed from the operating system. However, we still had a lot of its memory and patterns that still was playing out for us. But it was no longer necessary for us to advance because we could do it from that point through what our original design was, just experiencing ourselves, creating and experiencing different levels of realities without the necessity of polarities or contrast, and to advance from that point. Now, of course, we used a fraction of that, and we've used more and more of it as we moved forward. In 2012, the end of 2012, 2013, that was accentuated even further. Now, of course, during these periods of time, the energy of the planet continued to expand, so no longer even supporting the polarity and contrast parts. Our own energy did not resonate with that any longer, but we still had heavy programming and so forth. The matrix, the inverted matrix specifically, was still live and active for us. So that was still something that we were working through. And of course, we went through the different stages with the intent of making a huge leap and activating another phase going into 2017, but that was extended down to 2020. And so here we are in 2020 and forward, where now the realization of polarity and necessity of contrast is deeply fading within ourselves. And we're starting to realize that this is not how we make advanced progress. In fact, we are realizing that polarity and contrast is quite impeding, and it actually fluctuates our frequency so that when we are playing in the lower range, that we have reduced access of consciousness, and that actually impedes progress. And when we're in super high, or we're going into light, we have access, but it also restricts us to some degree too, because we're not embracing all spectrums. So we are accessing more, but we're still reducing the fuller spectrum of sourceness, what we call the 0 point neutrality aspect of our experience. So the polarity part is what we are now and have, especially things that have intensified this last year, to really get to the point of saturation and completion so that we unplug it. And of course, we're seeing the world of polarity and contrast hugely because of that. Now, how do we change that? Well, of course, energetically and everything else is pushing that to be purged. The inverted matrix is no longer streaming for us. We have much more support to go into our organic 3D and organic 5D state, leaving the inverted 3D and 2D or inverted 2D state, and to really set our home base on organic 3D and or 5D for the period of time and advance forward from that. So realizing that now polarity is actually an impedance. Now, if you still feel compelled to go through it, you can go through it for a period of time, achieve that saturation, but then realizing it does not serve and it will continue to impede you. Now, of course, the polarity is when we are also labeling through the ego right, wrong, good, bad. Now, that good, right, wrong, bad, light and dark has been labeled throughout our life. So if we are looking at our past experiences with the labels that have been applied, and in most cases definitions that have been applied as good, bad, right, wrong in the polarized contrasting world, then if you're utilizing any of that and bringing it to forth at this time, unless you're observing it and purging it, it can direct your life in a very powerful way. So if you feel bad about yourself and that label of that polarization is there, and then we're still utilizing it at this point, it's going to really shift your way of doing things in a big way. And it can impede, but not only impede, but it also plays a role that may be less than conducive for you to play with. Of course, everything is conducive to one degree or another, but it's not the most conducive for you. So looking at that right now is living in the moment, being fully present to play with that at this point, fully and completely. Then you're going to notice the polarity stuff is not beneficial and doesn't serve you in any way or another. And that's one of the part of the realizations that we're utilizing. So the world right now is accentuating polarity and contrast for us to reach a saturation point where we get rid of it. Now, if we're still looking at the world through the eyes of polarity, the eyes of contrast, going, these are good, these are bad, this is doing this and that, and we're still using judgment, because judgment requires polarity and contrast, because without polarity and contrast, there is no judgment. Through higher consciousness, there is no judgment. You see perfection in all that's playing out, and then you also see how things are becoming more obsolete, where we don't have to give as much power to it, and that is part of the shifting that is taking place and that we get involved in taking place. So the big question is, the purpose has been to experience ourselves in that world of polarity when we were living in that inverted matrix, inverted state of being, and we wanted to experience devolving instead of evolving. That purpose right now is still playing out to a certain degree to really achieve, first of all, an observation of its existence, because a lot of people don't observe that, don't see that existence. Others do, of course, and give it a lot of power. And a lot of people believe that it's necessary still. But we're coming to that realization where it's not necessary, and that this polarized part is actually quite impeding for us. So when we're looking at that, when we're looking at the world, if we let go of all of that, polarized, good, bad, right, wrong, then guess what? Then you see the beautiful perfection, and we can eliminate, clear out what no longer serves. And this is what's happening. That realization with more and more people is coming about. Because without polarization, we flourish much more freely. We create much more freely. We enlighten much more quickly. We get to a further level of observation and expression of ourselves much more with ease. And this is the beauty of all of it that's playing out. So, does it still serve? Not any longer, unless you have any parts of it that you're still utilizing and providing completion. But besides that, it does not serve any longer. And we're actually moving away from it. And we have for some time, but we are now moving away from it even more powerfully than ever before. So when people say that the world is designed on contrast and polarity, they are referring to the older version. That is the world that was impeded, or in this case, programmed to work in the invertedness of what we call the inverted matrix, which we have cleared out, but we still have part of that in our operating system. And of course, our inverted 3D, 2D state that we're purging. So the world and the galaxy, as much as some of that is still out in the galaxy part and the other solar systems and planets, for the most part, it's been purging rapidly on all levels. So right now, what we are doing is purging our version of it, even though it's not supported, but we are still experiencing and playing with it. So that was the real purpose of the polarity and contrast. And what's really taken on now is that does not serve any longer. And we have much more capacity, much more capable or capability to be able to step away from that game of polarity and contrast, because it was never our natural design, and it does not serve for us to continue to play it to the degree we've utilized up to this point in time. So use this knowing, which is triggering your own knowing, to shape your reality, where polarity and contrast is no longer required. There is no good, no bad, no right, no wrong. Everybody's playing a particular role, and the roles, most cases, have become obsolete and are no longer required. So that is what we're doing. We're purging obsolescence. We're purging what really may have been something that we've given a lot of power and validity to is no longer. So take that and go out and play. In the description, we have a bit of a write-up. We also have a link for you to connect with us on the community through the email. You also have access to our podcast and also our series on different platforms at this point in time. And also, if this information supports you, resonates for you, feel free to contribute. It really is greatly appreciated. It really helps us to continue to focus on putting out content on a daily basis, and in some cases double. And of course, if you're actually been part of the Advancing Consciousness series on YouTube, Facebook, Vimeo, or even on any of the other platforms, at this point in time, you've noticed how much content is being provided, and it's all freely available. Full courses, pretty well, and going into depth. So, anyways, until then, go out and play in the world that we have created, where no longer polarity and contrast is required.